The dress had long sleeves, a high collar, and a worked leather belt at the waist that she had found in her father's chest, tucked between old armor and yellowed letters. It was not the richest dress in the hall. She had known that before she even walked in. But it was the only dress that carried the dignity of a name, and the name Irwin still meant something. Even without a pack, even without lands, even without anyone alive to claim it besides her. Being chosen by Dorian Ashvale before the grand assembly of packs was not vanity. It was the only path Annie knew out of Edric's house, the beta who had taken her in out of obligation after her father's death and had treated her as silent labor for 18 years. She cooked, carried water, mended clothes, rose before the sun. There was no explicit cruelty in it. There was something worse. Absolute indifference. To Edric, she was a debt repaid in installments of domestic work. To the village, she was the dead warrior's daughter, respected in theory, ignored in practice. But Dorian had promised, 2 months ago, on the bank of the Calvin River, he had held her chin between his fingers and spoken with an intensity that had seemed unshakable. At the autumn assembly, I will claim you before everyone. My father will accept it. And if he doesn't, it doesn't matter. The decision is mine. She had studied his face in that moment, searching for hesitation. She had found none. And then she had committed the oldest mistake a woman can make. She believed him. The Hall of Ancient Stones was roaring when Annie walked through the main entrance. She had insisted on that with Petra, entering through the front, as a guest, not through the side door like a servant. Daughter of Irwin enters through the front, she had said, and Petra had agreed with the expression of someone who knows symbolism doesn't change reality, but understands that sometimes the gesture matters more than the outcome. The black stone-vaulted ceiling held hundreds of torches, and the golden light poured over clan banners hanging from the beams, red and gold of the ash veil, deep green and silver of the morn, deep black and amber of the veil. The smell was thick layers of burning resin, old leather, wine spiced with cinnamon and juniper, and beneath all of that the collective scent of alpha wolves in closed territory, an almost physical pressure in the air. Long oak tables overflowed with food and tankards. Voices filled the space all the way to the ceiling. Petra stayed at her side, wearing her best brown wool coat, her eyes jumping across the crowd the way they always did, calculating, cataloging, mentally preparing escape routes. Dorian is near his father's table, she said quietly. He looked over here when you walked in. Annie didn't look immediately. She needed a moment to plant her feet on the ground, to let her heart beat at the right rhythm before meeting his gaze. She held the bronze brooch at her collar, the Clan Irwin symbol, the only inheritance her father had left besides a name, and breathed in deeply the smell of resin and old wood. He promised, "That is real." Then she looked. Dorian was indeed near the family table, tall, well-dressed, with the Ashvale crest embroidered in gold thread on his chest. He saw her, and it was exactly that moment, the second their eyes met, that undid everything before a single word was spoken, because what she read on his face was not love, not resolution, not the face of a man about to keep a promise. It was the specific and unmistakable expression of someone who had made a different decision and had not yet found the courage to communicate it. Petra touched her arm. "Annie." "I know," she said. But she stayed. Because knowing and accepting are different things, and she was still in the knowing part, the ceremony followed its course. The Alpha Moor of the Viel opened the rituals with the traditional words. Alliances were declared, disputes presented, young wolves recognized by their leaders. And then came the hour of bonds, the part of the assembly where any wolf could rise before everyone and declare their choice of mate, irrevocable before the gathered witnesses. Dorian stood. The entire hall noticed. He was an Alpha's son, heir to the most powerful clan in the far north. When Dorian Ashvale rose to his feet, side conversations died naturally. Annie felt every pair of eyes in the room shift between him and her. Because there had been rumors. Rumors had been circulating through the village for weeks. Some had bet on it. Some had disapproved. The clanless girl, they said, the Ashvale heir, cannot. She had heard it and ignored it because he had promised, and a promise made on the bank of the Calvin River with his hand at her chin was more solid than rumors. "I declare my intention of bonding," said Dorian, with a steady voice and his gaze fixed on the center of the hall, on no particular place, with Seraphine Morn, daughter of Alpha Gregor Morn, in alliance between the Ashvale and Morn clans. The applause was immediate. Tankards struck tables. Dorian's father rose with a wide smile. Alpha Morn inclined his head in acknowledgement. Seraphine, blonde and tall in a green silk dress, walked to the center with the posture of someone who had rehearsed that moment in advance. Because she had rehearsed it, Annie realized, with the cold clarity of someone finally understanding the full extent of a betrayal. This had not been a last-minute decision. This had been planned while he held her chin on the riverbank and made promises. Someone laughed nearby, not at Dorian, at her, or at what she represented in that moment, the figure in a silver-gray dress standing between the columns with a dead clan symbol at her collar, and the expression of someone who had just understood she had been used as filler. One of the younger Ashvale sons said something to the brother beside him, and the brother answered with a smile, and Annie didn't hear the words but understood enough from the gesture. Petra stepped in front of her, blocking the line of sight with her own body. "Don't look at them," Petra said, low and firm. "Don't give them that." Annie wasn't looking at them. She was looking at Dorian, who had finally turned his eyes back to her. And what lived in that look was something she could only name afterward, much later, relief. He was relieved. The decision had been made, the family had been satisfied, and the inconvenience called Annie was where she was supposed to be, on the other side of the hall, unable to do anything. She felt heat rise up her neck and knew it was rage, not tears, and that distinction mattered more than anything else in that moment. "I will not cry here. I will not beg. I will not give anyone the satisfaction of watching this destroy me in this hall." She breathed once, twice, and began walking toward the exit. She did not run. She kept her head up. She kept her steps even. It was the only control she still had, the way she would leave that room. And she held onto it as though it were the last possession she owned, because it was. She had made it nearly halfway across when the hall, inexplicably, went quiet. Not the gradual quiet of a conversation emptying out, an immediate quiet, instinctive, the kind that happens when something enters a space that carries enough weight to compress the air around it. Annie stopped without meaning to. It was wolf reflex. When the pressure of the environment shifts that way, the body stops before the mind gives the order. She turned her head. 3 men had entered through the main entrance. There was no announcement, no escorts, none of the usual protocol of clan introduction. They simply walked in, and the entire hall had swallowed hard. All 3 wore absolute black, no embroidery, no colored insignia. Only one symbol, small and precise, on the shoulder of the man in the center, a crescent moon above a crown of bone, the Lycan house. The Lycan king had made 20 documented visits to the continent in the last 100 years. Annie had read about every single one in old records she had found in Edric's library, records Edric had never opened, but that she had devoured on winter nights when everyone was asleep. She knew what that symbol meant. She knew what his presence in that hall meant. The man in the center was tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair, and eyes of an amber so deep they seemed to carry their own light. He was not scanning the hall the way any person would upon entering an unfamiliar space. He simply looked, with the absolute calm of someone who had never needed to assess a room, because no room had ever represented danger to him in his entire life, and then the amber eyes found hers. Annie didn't look away. She was too exhausted to calculate what was prudent. She was standing in the middle of the hall with a broken heart, and her dead father's brooch at her collar, and 4 weeks of needlework on her body, and the Lycan king was looking at her with an attention she could not classify as sympathy, curiosity, or judgment. It was something simpler and more disturbing than any of the 3. It was recognition, as though he already knew who she was before he walked in. She didn't plan what she said next. It came before she could filter it, in that strange place between destroyed pride and total exhaustion where the mind stops calculating consequences. She took 1 step toward him, just 1, and asked, quiet enough that only he could hear, "Do you need a wife by tomorrow?" The hall had gone quiet before. Now there was a different kind of silence. The silence of the 2 men beside him holding their breath. The silence of the Lycan king who had perhaps spent decades without anyone addressing him a question in that tone, in that specific mixture of honest desperation and absolute lack of ceremony. He held her gaze for 3 full heartbeats. And then he said, in the quietest and most controlled voice Annie had ever heard, "How do you know that?" The 2 men flanking him reacted before the hall did. the one on the left, younger, with sharp green eyes, and the kind of jaw that suggested he had broken it at least once and it had healed slightly wrong, let out a short sound that was not quite a laugh. It was the sound of someone genuinely surprised, which, by the look of him, did not happen often. The one on the right said nothing. He was broader than the other two, with a scar running from his left temple to the corner of his mouth, and he studied Annie with the focused patience of someone who assessed threats for a living. Not hostile. Simply precise. The man in the center, the one with amber eyes and the crescent moon on his shoulder, had not moved at all. The hall was still watching. Annie was aware of that with the specific, crawling awareness of prey that knows it is exposed, but she did not look away from the Lycan king. Looking away felt like the wrong thing to do, the way stepping back from a fire that hasn't decided whether to burn you, yet feels like the wrong thing to do. "How do you know that?" he asked again. Still quiet. Still absolutely level. "There were letters," Annie said. Her voice came out steadier than she had any right to expect. "In a library. Old correspondence between the Lycan house and the Northern Highland clans. One of them, dated 3 cycles past, referenced a succession clause. The Lycan king must present a bonded mate before the winter solstice, or cede territorial claim over the Highland passes to the Council of Elders." She paused. "The solstice is in 2 days." The younger man on the left made the not-quite-laugh sound again, louder this time. "She read the letters," he said, to no one in particular. "Caius, she read the letters." "I heard her," said the man in the center. "Caius." The name settled in Annie's chest with a weight she hadn't expected. She had read it in those same letters, written in formal script at the bottom of official documents. Caius, of the Lycan house, first king of the ancient blood. Somehow it had seemed like a title more than a name. Standing in front of him, it seemed like something else entirely. "The library where you found those letters," Caius said. "Where is it?" "In a house in the lower village, the Beta Edric. He doesn't know he has them. He doesn't read." Something shifted almost imperceptibly in Caius's expression. Not surprise. More like the adjustment a person makes when a calculation they were running quietly in their head suddenly produces an unexpected result. "Your name," he said. "Annie, daughter of Wren, of Clan Irwin." The name landed in the room differently than she expected. Differently than it ever had when she introduced herself in the village, where it produced polite nods and quick topic changes. Here, the broader man on the right, the one with the scar, went very still in a specific way that was not the stillness of indifference. Caius looked at her for another long moment. Then, without turning his head, he spoke to the hall at large. Not loudly, just with the quality of a voice that traveled without effort. "We will need the east wing prepared." The hall did not erupt. It absorbed. That was somehow worse, or better. Annie wasn't certain which. The way 200 wolves simply accepted the statement and began quietly rearranging their understanding of the evening. Dorian Ashvale, still standing near his family's table with Seraphine at his side, had gone the color of old ash. Petra found her 12 minutes later in the corridor outside the east wing, where Annie had been deposited by a castle servant, with instructions to wait, and had spent those 12 minutes standing very still with her back to the stone wall and her hands pressed flat against the cold rock, grounding herself against the very real possibility that she had lost her mind entirely. "Annie." Petra's voice came from the corridor entrance, half-whispered, completely frantic. "What did you do?" "I'm not entirely sure," Annie said honestly. "You spoke to the Lycan king." "I asked him a question." "You asked the Lycan king." Petra walked to her in 3 fast steps and grabbed both her hands. "If he needed a wife. By tomorrow." He did need one. He still does, technically. The conversation didn't resolve that part yet. Petra stared at her. In the torchlight, her friend's face moved through several emotions in quick succession. Terror. Disbelief. A brief flash of something that might have been awe. And then back to terror. "Annie. Do you understand who that man is?" "I understand exactly who he is. That's why I asked. He could have had you removed. He could have..." He didn't. Petra fell quiet. That was the thing neither of them had a ready answer for. He hadn't. He had looked at her for 3 heartbeats and asked how she knew. And that was not the response of a man who found the question offensive or absurd. That was the response of a man who found it interesting. Annie was not naive enough to believe interest was the same as safety. But it was something to work with. "What happens now?" Petra asked. "I wait," he said, to prepare the east wing. The east wing of a castle that belongs to the High Vial lords, who are hosting a man powerful enough to make this entire assembly go silent by walking through a door. Petra pressed her fingers to her temple. "Annie, your father would—" "My father is dead," Annie said. Not harshly, just clearly. "And I have been the dead warrior's daughter my whole life. And tonight the dead warrior's daughter was publicly humiliated in front of every pack in the Northern Highland so that Dorian Ashvale could secure a better alliance. And if the Lycan King wants to speak to me, then I am going to speak to the Lycan King." Petra looked at her for a long time. Then she exhaled, straightened her coat, and said, "If something goes wrong, I want you to know I will absolutely cause a scene on your behalf." "I know," Annie said. "That's why you're my only friend." Caius came to the east corridor 20 minutes after the hall had resumed its noise. He came alone, which Annie had not expected. The two men who flanked him everywhere, she had begun thinking of them as the sharp-jawed one and the scarred one, were absent. He walked without ceremony and stopped a measured distance from her, close enough for conversation, far enough that she didn't feel cornered. That distance felt deliberate. He looked different without the hall framing him. Smaller in the sense that rooms have a way of making powerful men seem like architecture. And without the room, he was simply a man. Still tall, still carrying that quality of compressed stillness that made the air around him feel more dense, but a man nonetheless. "You said you read the letters," he said. "I did. All of them. All that were there, 14 documents across 3 correspondence chains. The succession clause was in the 7th. He was quiet for a moment. Not uncomfortable quiet, thinking quiet. She was beginning to understand the difference. "Most people who discover information like that use it for leverage," he said. "They send word through intermediaries. They arrange meetings through political channels. They do not walk across a crowded hall and whisper the question directly to the subject." "I didn't have anything to arrange a meeting with," Annie said. "No intermediaries, no political channels. I had a question, and you were standing there. Why did you need to ask at all?" She considered lying, or softening it. She decided against both, because 20 minutes ago, the man who promised to claim me as his mate chose someone else in front of everyone I know. And I needed to do something that was my own choice before I walked out of this hall and went back to being nothing. She met his gaze steadily. "The question was my own choice. Whatever the answer is, I made it." Caius looked at her for what felt like a very long time. "The succession clause is real," he said finally. "The council has been pushing it for 2 years. I have been resistant to the process they prefer, which involves selecting from a curated list of high-blooded candidates they consider appropriate. And you came to this assembly looking for something else. I came because my advisor believed the answer might be here." A pause. "He is occasionally right about things that seem unlikely." "The scarred one?" Annie asked. The corner of Caius's mouth moved. It was not quite a smile. It was the evidence that a smile was a thing his face was capable of, even if it rarely completed the journey. "His name is Rowan," Caius said. "And yes, him." What did he think he'd find here? He didn't specify. He rarely does. He finds it more efficient to simply be correct and wait for the rest of us to catch up. Annie looked at him, at the amber eyes that were watching her with that quality of attention that she still couldn't entirely name. Not hunger, not calculation, not the particular way men looked at women they thought they could manage, something more patient than any of those. "I should tell you," she said, "that I have no clan. My father's pack was destroyed in the Northern Campaign 18 years ago, and no lord has claimed the Irwin survivors. I have no blood alliance, no political value, no resources, and no territory. If you are looking for a strategic match, I am the least strategic person in this hall." "I'm aware," Caius said. "You're aware. Rowan did the research before we entered." He recognized the Irwin brooch. His eyes moved briefly to the bronze symbol at her collar. "Your father served under my grandfather in the campaign of the Pale Ridge. He held the eastern flank for 9 hours against a force 3 times his size, so the retreat could be completed. He saved 400 lives and received nothing for it because the lord who should have rewarded him had already died in the first hour." Annie's throat tightened in a way she hadn't prepared for. The Lycan house has owed a debt to the Irwin line for 18 years. Caius continued, with the same level tone, as if he were reading from those same old letters. I was 17 when it happened. I didn't have the authority to act on it then. He looked at her directly. I do now. The corridor was cold. The torchlight moved. Somewhere far down the hall, the assembly was still underway. Voices and music, and the clinking of celebration that felt like it belonged to a completely different world. Annie pressed her fingers once against the bronze brooch and made herself breathe evenly. That's not an answer to my question, she said. No, Caius agreed. It isn't. Another pause, shorter this time. Come to the East Hall at first light. We will speak properly then. Bring the girl who was standing with you. She looks like someone who will need to hear what is said directly rather than through a second-hand account. He turned to leave, then stopped. The dress, he said, without turning back. The stitching on the belt. Is that Irwin pattern work? Annie looked down at the worked leather at her waist. Yes. I copied it from my father's armor. Caius was quiet for one breath. It's accurate, he said, and then he walked away down the corridor, his footsteps nearly soundless on the old stone floor. Annie stood in the torchlight, with her back against the cold wall and the bronze brooch under her fingers, and tried very carefully to understand what had just happened to her evening. She didn't sleep. Petra had found them a small room in the castle's lower guest quarters. One of the rooms kept for attendants and minor visitors, with a narrow bed, a wool blanket that smelled of cedar, and a single candle that burned down to nothing before midnight. Annie lay on her back in the dark and stared at the ceiling and listened to the distant sounds of the assembly winding down, footsteps in corridors, voices dropping to murmurs, the occasional bark of laughter from men who had found the bottom of too many tankards. Petra had fallen asleep sitting upright against the wall, which was a talent Annie had always found both impressive and deeply concerning. The cold was the kind that lived in stone buildings, not bitter, but constant. Annie pulled the blanket tighter and thought about Caius's voice in the corridor. The specific flatness of it, not cold exactly, but stripped of the performance that most powerful men wrapped around their words. Dorian had always spoken as though someone was watching and evaluating. Every statement slightly shaped for an audience even when there was no audience. Caius spoke as though the words only needed to be true. The audience was irrelevant. She thought about what he had said about her father. He held the eastern flank for 9 hours. He saved 400 lives and received nothing for it. She had known pieces of the story. Edric had told her fragments over the years, usually when she asked directly, and he was tired enough not to deflect. Her father had been a good fighter. Her father had been loyal. Her father had died doing what he was supposed to do, and the lord he served had died first, and the whole thing had simply fallen through the cracks of history, the way inconvenient debts tend to do. She had not known about the 400 lives. She had not known the Lycan house had been watching. Sleep did not come. First light did. The East Hall was smaller than the main assembly room, but carried a different kind of weight. A working room, not a ceremonial one, with a long table of dark wood, maps pinned to the stone walls with iron nails, and candles already burning in iron holders despite the early hour. The smell here was different, less resin, more ink and cold air, and something underneath it all that she was beginning to recognize as specific to Caius, though she couldn't have described it precisely. Dark wood and winter stone, and something older than both. Roan was already there when Annie and Petra arrived. He stood near the window, arms crossed, and assessed them both with the same focused precision Annie had noticed the night before. In daylight, gray and thin as it was, filtering through narrow stone windows, the scar on his face was more visible and less severe-looking. It had healed cleanly. Someone had known what they were doing when they stitched it. The sharp-jawed man was leaning against the wall near the door with his arms folded, and an expression of mild entertainment already in place, as though he had arrived expecting the morning to be interesting, and was not disappointed. The one who asked the question, he said, when Annie walked in. Not rude. Simply identifying. The one who laughed, Annie replied. He pointed at her. I like her. You like everyone who surprises you, Roan said, without turning from the window. It's not a high bar. His name is Stellan, said Caius, from the far end of the table, where he was already seated with a cup of something dark and steaming in front of him. He is my cousin. and he finds most situations funnier than they are. You will get used to it or you won't. Either way, he doesn't stop. Stellan pressed a hand to his chest with an expression of wounded dignity that convinced no one. Petra had gone very still in the way she went still when she was absorbing information faster than she could process it. Annie touched her arm briefly. "Stay with me." And Petra exhaled and straightened. They sat across from Caius. Rowan moved from the window to stand at Caius's right. Stellan remained at the wall, apparently preferring to observe from a position that allowed him to see everyone's faces at once. Caius looked at Annie directly. "I'll explain what you've walked into," he said. "And then you can decide." "All right." The succession clause exists precisely as you described it. The Council of Elders, 12 lords representing the oldest Highland packs, inserted it into the territorial agreements 2 generations ago as a way to ensure the Lycan house remained connected to continental politics through blood alliance. The intention was to control who I bond with. They have a list. A pause. I find the list objectionable. Why? Because every name on it belongs to a family that wants something specific from the union, and what they want is not a partnership. It is proximity to power with the appearance of legitimacy. The woman I bond with would be a decoration, a political instrument. His voice carried no particular heat on this point, just clarity. I don't intend to do that to anyone. Annie looked at him. But the clause still stands. The clause still stands. If I arrive at the winter solstice without a bonded mate, territorial claim over the Highland passes reverts to the Council. They will use that territory to fracture the northern alliances I have spent 12 years building. Hundreds of smaller packs that currently have protection under Lycan authority will lose that protection overnight. So it's not just about you. It was never about me. Petra, who had been silent, spoke carefully. Why not simply choose someone from their list and manage the politics afterward? Rowan answered before Caius could. Because any woman from that list comes with her family's agenda embedded in the bond. In the old law, a Lycan bond is not a contract. It cannot be managed afterward. What is bound completely. Petra absorbed this, so you need someone with no political family, no agenda, no lord to answer to, someone who comes to the bond with nothing attached, Rowan said. Yes. The room was quiet for a moment. Annie looked at the map on the wall behind Caius. The northern Highland passes were marked in dark ink, a chain of routes through mountain territory that connected dozens of pack settlements to trade, to safety, to each other. She knew some of those settlements by name from Edric's letters. Small packs, old packs, packs that had survived by staying under the protection of something larger. I want to be clear about something, she said. Caius waited. Last night I asked you a question that was half desperation and half the kind of impulse you get when you've stopped calculating, because calculating hasn't helped. She kept her voice even. I'm not half desperate this morning, so I need to ask you properly. Not the question from last night. A different one. Ask, he said. If I agree to this, what am I agreeing to? Not politically, not territorially. What am I agreeing to for myself? The quality of silence that followed was different from the ones before. Stellan had stopped performing casual indifference. Rowan was watching Caius with an expression that was almost careful. Caius set down the cup. The Lycan bond is permanent, he said. That is the first thing. There is no dissolution, no reversal. What is made is made. I understand that. You would come to the Lycan hold in the northern ranges. It is not a court the way the Highland lords use the word. It is a working seat, a fortress built for function, not ceremony. Cold most of the year, remote. His eyes held hers steadily. You would have your own rooms, your own authority within the hold, and the full protection of Lycan law, which supersedes every clan claim on the continent, including the councils. No one who has wronged you would have standing to come near you. Annie was careful not to react visibly to that last part. And the bond itself, she said. What does it require? A formal declaration before witnesses at the solstice ritual. A pause. And time. The rest of it takes time. I won't pretend otherwise. You mean we would be strangers, for a while? Yes. She looked at him. He looked back at her. There was something almost uncomfortable about how directly he held eye contact. Not aggressive, just complete. Like a man who had decided the most respectful thing he could offer was his full attention. Can I ask you something that isn't about the clause or the territory, she said. You can ask me anything. Last night in the hall. Before I said anything, you were looking at me before I walked toward you. She watched his face. Why? Stellan made a quiet sound near the wall. Roan appeared to study a map with sudden intense interest. Caius was quiet for 3 full seconds. Your scent, he said finally. It reached the entrance before we did. Before I saw you, or knew anything about you. He paused, as though choosing the next words with more care than usual. I have been to many assemblies. I have been in rooms full of wolves my entire life. I have never smelled anything like it. Annie had no ready response to that. What does it smell like? Petra asked, with the tone of someone who has decided that if this situation is going to be extraordinary, she is going to get complete information about it. Stellan covered his mouth. Roan pinched the bridge of his nose. Caius looked at Petra with an expression that suggested he was unaccustomed to being asked to elaborate on things he considered self-evident, but answered anyway. Old forest after rain, he said. Cold iron. And something underneath that I don't have a word for. Something that doesn't belong to this generation of wolves. His eyes moved back to Annie, something much older. The fire in the iron holder crackled. Outside the narrow windows, the gray morning was beginning to let in a little more light. Annie thought about the Irwin brooch at her collar. The warrior pack that had held the eastern flank for 9 hours and received nothing. The old letters in Edric's library that she had read in secret by candlelight. The dress she had sewn for a man who had already decided, and the question she had asked instead. She thought about 400 lives and Highland passes, and a bond that could not be undone. She looked at Caius across the dark wood table, and made the only decision that felt like it belonged to her. When does the solstice ritual begin? She asked. Something in Caius's face settled. Not relief exactly. More like a tension that had been present since before she arrived, quietly releasing its hold. Sundown, he said. 2 days from now. Then we have 2 days, Annie said. We should probably not be strangers for the entire 2 days. Stellan laughed. A real one this time, full and unguarded. The laugh of someone who had not expected to find the morning genuinely enjoyable. Even Roan's severe expression shifted briefly into something that might, in better lighting, have been called a smile. Caius looked at her with those amber eyes that held their own light. No, he said quietly. We probably shouldn't. 2 days was not enough time to know a person. Annie understood that. She had no illusions about what the solstice ritual would make permanent. A bond with a man she had met across a crowded hall less than 24 hours ago. A man who spoke in measured sentences and held eye contact like a commitment and had told her she smelled like old forest and something without a name. 2 days was not enough, but 2 days was what existed, and she had spent enough of her life waiting for better circumstances to arrive before she allowed herself to want things. Better circumstances had a way of not arriving. So she used the 2 days. Caius was not an easy man to know quickly. He was not closed. She had expected closed, had prepared for walls and carefully managed distance, the way powerful men often used silence as a kind of armor. He wasn't that. He was simply slow in the way that deep water is slow, not still, not empty, just moving at a pace that required patience to follow. He answered every question she asked directly. He did not perform humility or authority. He simply was what he was, and let her observe it. On the first morning, after the meeting in the East Hall, he took her through the castle's upper corridors to a room the Vial Lords used as a study, where he spread the Highland maps across a wide table and explained the territorial situation in detail. Not a summary. The full picture, where the passes ran, which packs held which routes, what the Council of Elders had been doing quietly for the past decade to position themselves for exactly this moment. He spoke to her as though her understanding of it mattered, as though she was someone who would need to know these things going forward, not someone who needed to be managed. She asked questions. He answered them. She pushed back twice on points where his reasoning seemed to have gaps, and both times he stopped, considered it, and adjusted his position, not to please her. Because she had been right. That was the part she kept returning to afterward. Stellan found them there at midday, and inserted himself into the conversation, with the particular energy of someone constitutionally incapable of observing from a distance, when he could be participating. He was sharper than his easy manner suggested. Annie caught that quickly. The jokes were real, but they were also a tool. He used humor the way some men used silence, to watch how people responded when their guard dropped. He asked her about Clan Irwin. She told him what she knew, which was less than she would have liked. Fragments from Edric's reluctant answers. Pieces from the old letters. The stories her father had apparently told to no one directly, but that had filtered back to her in distorted forms through village memory. The warrior pack of the far north. Loyal to a fault. Gone in a single campaign. Your father had a name in the old records, Stellan said. Not lightly, for once. Wren of the eastern flank. Some of the older Lycans use it still when they talk about what a soldier is supposed to be. Annie pressed her thumbnail into the edge of the map table and said nothing for a moment. He died, broke and unclaimed, she said. Yes, Stellan said. That's the part that makes the name mean something, I think. He did it anyway. She looked at him. He looked back with those sharp green eyes that were, at that moment, completely serious. Caius said nothing, but his hand, resting on the table near the map, moved 2 inches closer to hers. He didn't touch her, just moved closer. She was not sure he was aware he had done it. She was aware. Petra spent the first day gathering information with the focused efficiency of someone who had decided that if her best friend was about to bond with the Lycan king, she was going to understand exactly what that meant before it happened. She cornered Roan twice, an endeavor Annie privately considered either very brave or very foolish, and which Roan appeared to tolerate with the resignation of a man who recognized a determined person and had calculated that resistance would cost more time than compliance. By evening, Petra had assembled a working understanding of Lycan hold structure, the hierarchy of the king's inner circle, the practical geography of the northern ranges, and what the bond ceremony actually involved. She reported all of this to Annie in their small room that night, with the systematic thoroughness of a military briefing. The ceremony itself is not complicated, Petra said. Declaration before witnesses at sundown. The formal words. Then the Lycan mark. He marks you. You mark him. Both willing. It's done. The mark. It doesn't hurt. Or it does, but not badly. Roan was somewhat vague on that point, which I choose to interpret as diplomatic rather than concerning. What did you make of Roan? Petra was quiet for a moment, which was unusual. Careful, she said finally. Very careful. The kind of careful that comes from having been in situations where not being careful had consequences. A pause. He asked me 2 questions about you that he already knew the answers to. I think he was checking whether I would lie for you. Would you? Obviously, Petra said, without hesitation. But I didn't need to, which I think was the point of the test. Annie looked at the ceiling. The candle was burning lower. Somewhere in the upper part of the castle, she could feel, not hear, feel, a low-frequency awareness that she had been noticing since yesterday, and that she was beginning to understand was not general anxiety, but something more specific. The presence of Caius, moving through the castle's upper corridors at whatever hour Lycans apparently kept. Are you frightened? Petra asked. Annie considered the question honestly. Not of him, she said. Of the permanence. Of choosing something this large when I've had less than 2 days to hold it. You've had 23 years of the alternative. Petra said quietly. Being careful. Being small. Being the dead warrior's daughter with no clan and no standing. And a vestido sewn for a man who was already planning something else. She pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders. What did the careful get you? Annie had no answer for that, because the answer was self-evident and they both knew it. Go to sleep, Petra said. Tomorrow is the last day before the solstice. Use it. She found Caius in the early morning on the castle's eastern wall, before the gray light had fully decided to become day. He was standing at the parapet looking north, where the mountains were a dark suggestion against a darker sky, and he was alone in the way that felt chosen, rather than accidental. She stood beside him without announcing herself. He didn't startle. She hadn't expected him to, but he turned his head and looked at her with an expression that was quieter than his usual careful steadiness. Less managed. The expression of someone caught being simply himself before the day required him to be anything else. You couldn't sleep either, she said. I don't sleep much in general, he said. Like in metabolism. The nights are useful for thinking. What were you thinking about? He looked back at the mountains. A long pause. Not evasion. She knew that now. Just the pace of him. Whether I am asking too much, he said. Annie leaned her forearms on the cold stone parapet. You didn't ask. I offered. You offered in a moment of pain. His voice was even, but there was something careful underneath it. I want to be certain that the offer still stands when the pain is less immediate. She thought about that, about Dorian's relieved expression and 3 weeks of sewn silk thread and the sound of the assembly applauding an alliance that had been arranged while promises were being made at the riverside. The pain wasn't less immediate. It was different. It had moved from sharp to settled. The way a bruise changes from acute to present. It was still there. She didn't think it would stop being there simply because something else had happened. But it wasn't why she was standing here. "Can I tell you something true?" she said. "Please. When you told me about my father last night, the eastern flank, the 400 lives," she kept her eyes on the dark mountains. "No one has ever told me that before. Not because they didn't know, clearly some people knew, but because to most people, what my father did is a footnote. A dead soldier from a dead clan." She paused. "You said the Lycan house has owed a debt to the Irwin line for 18 years. I don't want to be a debt repaid." "I need to be honest about that. I know," Caius said. "That is not what this is." "Then what is it?" He turned to look at her fully. In the gray pre-dawn light, his amber eyes were darker, the gold in them muted and deeper. "When I walked into that hall last night," he said, "Roan had told me we were looking for someone. He didn't say who. He rarely does. He said I would know." A pause. "And then your scent reached me before I crossed the threshold, and I knew." "Knew what?" "That, whoever you were not on the council's list. You were not something shaped by politics or position or expectation." He held her gaze with that complete, unperformed attention that she was beginning to understand was simply how he was. "And then you walked across the hall and asked me the most direct question anyone has asked me in 15 years of rule, and I thought, this is someone who does not know how to be anything other than exactly herself, even when it costs her." Annie's throat tightened for the second time in 2 days, and again she hadn't prepared for it. "That's a significant amount to conclude from one question," she said. "I also had the scent," he said. And the corner of his mouth moved in that not-quite smile that she had now identified as the closest his face came to open warmth. She laughed. Briefly, softly. It surprised her more than it surprised him. They stood on the eastern wall while the gray light slowly made up its mind about becoming morning, and the mountains to the north shifted from dark suggestion to real mass. And Annie thought about permanence and choice, and the difference between a decision made from desperation and a decision made from clarity. By the time the light was full, she knew which one this was. The solstice ritual took place in the castle's outer courtyard as sundown drained the last of the light from the sky. The assembly had not dispersed. Word had traveled through the halls with the speed that important information always travels in enclosed spaces full of attentive wolves. And by the time the torches were lit in the courtyard, there were 200 wolves standing witness. Annie had not planned for an audience. But she stood in the courtyard in her silver-gray dress, with the Irwin brooch at her collar and her spine straight, and she found that the audience no longer frightened her the way it had the night before. Let them watch. She was choosing this. It was hers. Caius stood before her in formal black, with the crescent moon and bone crown symbol visible at his shoulder. In the torchlight, he looked exactly like what he was. Ancient blood, old power, the kind of authority that doesn't require performance. And he was looking at her with that complete, undefended attention that she had spent 2 days learning to read. Stellan stood to the left with an expression that was, for once, not performing anything. Roan stood to the right, steady as a standing stone. Petra stood at the edge of the witness circle, chin up, eyes bright, pressing her thumbnail into her palm, the way she did when she was holding very still against the urge to cry. The formal words were old, older than the Highland clans, older than the council's clauses, older than the political maps pinned with iron nails in the East Hall study. They were the words of the first bonds, in the old Lycan tongue that Annie had read fragments of in Edric's letters, and now heard spoken aloud for the first time in a voice she was beginning to know. She answered in the same tongue. The words had been in those letters too. She had not planned to know them. She was grateful, standing here, that she had read everything. Caius's expression when she answered in the old language was the first fully unguarded thing she had seen on his face. Not just the almost smile, something complete and unmanaged. Something that looked, in the torchlight with the solstice sky above them, very much like wonder. The mark came last. It was brief, and Roan had been right. It was not painless, but it was bearable, and it was immediately followed by something she had no prior framework for. A warmth that settled into the base of her chest, like a coal that had been placed there gently and would not be moved. Not overwhelming, not frightening, just present, steady, real. When it was done, Caius looked at her. "Annie of Clan Irwin," he said quietly, for her alone. "Caius of the Lycan house," she answered. 200 wolves bore witness to the bond that sealed the Highland passes under Lycan protection and removed the council's leverage in a single solstice night. But those 200 wolves were, at that moment, very far away. The council sent representatives the following morning. 3 of them arrived at the castle gates before breakfast, wearing the formal gray cloaks of the Elder Assembly and expressions that had been arranged into diplomatic neutrality over what Annie suspected was considerable fury underneath. They were received in the East Hall, the same room where she had sat across from Caius 2 mornings ago, and asked him what she was agreeing to. She sat beside him now. That had been Caius's decision, stated the night before without particular ceremony. "You sit with me. Not behind me, not to the side. With me. Whatever is said to both of us." She had not argued. The lead representative was a man named Aldrich. Thin, silver-haired, with the careful posture of someone who had spent decades in rooms where the wrong word ended careers. He looked at Annie once when he entered. A long, assessing look that moved from the Irwin brooch to her face, to the Lycan mark visible at the base of her throat. And then he looked at Caius, and did not look at her again. She noted this. She filed it. "The bond was made," Aldrich said. "Not a question." "It was," Caius said. "Before the solstice deadline, before witnesses. 200 of them, including your own observer, who I noticed in the courtyard." Caius's voice carried no particular satisfaction, just accuracy. "The clause is satisfied. The Highland passes remain under Lycan protection. The territorial agreements stand." Aldrich's jaw moved slightly. "The council's position is that the spirit of the succession clause required a match of appropriate blood standing. The council's clause specified a bonded mate before the winter solstice," Caius said. "It specified nothing else. I have read it 14 times. So has Roan, who is more thorough than I am," he paused. "If the council wishes to contest the bond, they are welcome to bring the argument to the old tribunal. The old tribunal has not convened in 200 years, because the last time it did, the outcome was not favorable to the council's predecessors. I am content to let history repeat itself." Aldrich looked at his 2 colleagues. Something passed between them that was not quite a conversation. "The council will review its position," Aldrich said finally, with the tone of a man conceding a battle while attempting to suggest it was merely a recess. "The council is welcome too," Caius said. "In the meantime, the Highland Pack agreements will be renewed under the current protection terms within the fortnight. I will send the documents through Roan." The representatives left. Aldrich paused at the door, just briefly, just long enough to look at Annie directly for the second and final time. She met his gaze without expression, and held it until he looked away first. When the door closed, Stellan, who had been standing against the wall with his arms folded, exhaled loudly. "I've been waiting 3 years for that," he said. 3 years of watching Aldrich sit in rooms and arrange his face like that while he dismantled things. He pointed at Annie. "You, specifically, ruined his entire plan by existing. I want you to know I consider that a profound personal gift." "Stellan," Roan said. "I'm being sincere." "I know. That's why I said your name." Annie looked at Caius. He was watching her with that steady amber attention. "You held the gaze," he said quietly. "He looked away first," she said. The corner of his mouth completed the journey this time. A full, unhurried smile that changed his face entirely. Not softer, exactly, but more inhabited, more present. The face of a man who was, in that moment, entirely where he was. She stored it carefully, the way she had stored things her whole life that she was afraid of losing. They left the castle 2 days later. The Highland lords gave them a formal departure. Banners, ceremony, The works. Annie stood in the courtyard in a traveling cloak that Caius had produced from somewhere, deep charcoal gray with a lining of black fur, and watched the proceedings with the slightly surreal quality that had settled over the last 4 days like a permanent low light. Things kept happening that she had not planned for. She had stopped trying to plan and started simply paying attention, which felt more honest anyway. Petra stood beside her until the last possible moment. "I need you to tell me honestly," Petra said, low enough for only Annie to hear, "whether you are all right. Not performing all right. Actually all right." Annie thought about it the way Petra deserved. Seriously, without the reflex reassurance. "I think so," she said. "I think I will be." She paused. "I think this is the first decision I've made in my entire life that was entirely mine, and that counts for something even when the rest of it is uncertain." Petra looked at her for a long moment. Then she did something she almost never did. She pulled Annie into a full embrace, both arms, brief and fierce and completely unperformed. "I'm coming to visit," Petra said into her shoulder. "I don't care how far the northern ranges are. I will find a way." "Roan will arrange it," Annie said. "He arranges everything." "I noticed," Petra said, with a tone that was not entirely about logistics, and pulled back before Annie could examine it further. She would come to visit. Annie knew it with the certainty of knowing Petra, the woman who had stood beside her in the Hall of Ancient Stones and blocked the line of sight with her own body when the laughter started. She would come. And when she did, she would have questions about Roan that she had carefully not asked yet, and Annie would be there to hear them. That was its own kind of future, small and specific and real. Dorian Asheville appeared at the edge of the courtyard as the traveling party was preparing to move. Annie saw him before he saw her. He was standing near the gate column, half in shadow, wearing the same formal clothes from the assembly night. He looked like a man who had slept badly and was not accustomed to it. When his eyes found her in the traveling cloak with the Lycan mark visible above her collar, something crossed his face that she recognized after a moment as the specific expression of someone calculating what they have lost only after the losing is complete. He took a step toward her. Caius, who had been speaking with Roan 6 feet away, stopped speaking. He didn't move toward Dorian. He didn't need to. He simply stopped and turned, and the quality of attention he directed at Dorian Asheville was different from every other quality of attention Annie had seen him use. Not aggressive, not threatening in any performed way, just absolute. The attention of something very old and very certain being asked if it would like to have a problem this morning. Dorian stopped walking. He looked at Annie. She looked back at him. She waited to feel something sharp. The anger from the assembly hall, the cold that had replaced it, the particular grief of believing someone and being wrong. She found something quieter than she expected. Not forgiveness exactly, more like distance. The sensation of standing far enough from something that it had lost the power to cut. She had sewn a dress for him, 3 weeks of needle and silk thread, and the careful hope of a woman who had been invisible long enough that she had started measuring her own worth in whether the right person would finally see her. He had looked at her from across the hall with relief at having escaped a complication. Caius had walked across the continent with Roan's quiet certainty and found her by scent before he even saw her face. She did not say any of this to Dorian. There was nothing to say to Dorian. He was a man who had made a cowardly choice and would likely make cowardly choices for the rest of his life, and she would not be present for any of them. She turned away. It was the most complete thing she had ever done. The road north was long. Annie had known it would be. The Lycan ranges were 3 days' travel from the Highland Castle, through mountain passes that opened into a landscape she had only ever read about. The cold deepened as they rode. The trees changed character, growing denser and darker, and the air developed a clarity that felt almost aggressive, as though it had decided to be entirely honest about itself. Caius rode beside her, not ahead. Beside. On the first evening, they stopped at a way station built into the rock of the pass. Low ceilings, heavy stone, fire in the center that smelled of pine and something resinous that Annie could not name. They ate at a rough table, and Stellan told a story about a diplomatic trip that had gone comprehensively wrong in ways that Annie was not entirely sure she believed, but chose to enjoy anyway. And Roan refuted 3 details with the systematic patience of someone for whom accuracy was a moral position. Annie sat across from Caius and watched him in the firelight. He caught her watching and didn't look away. Neither did she. On the second day, riding through a pass where the mountains rose close on both sides and the sky was a narrow strip of pale winter blue above them, He told her more about the hold, the structure of it, the people in it, the ones she would meet, the ones who would test her, the few who would be genuinely glad of her arrival. He described the great hall with its windows cut directly into the mountain rock, the way the morning light came through at an angle that turned everything briefly golden. He described the library. How large? She asked. Larger than Edric's, he said. That is not a high bar. 4,000 volumes, he said. Some of them older than the Highland clans. Some in the old Lycan tongue. She looked at him. You'll be able to read some of them already, he said, based on what you demonstrated at the solstice. She looked back at the pass ahead of them. The narrow blue sky, the cold that was beginning to feel less like an absence of warmth and more like a presence. Something with its own character, its own honesty. I want to ask you something, she said. You always can. The scent, she said. The thing you said was old, older than this generation of wolves. She paused. Do you know what it is? Caius was quiet for a moment, riding quiet, the kind that belonged to movement and open air. Rowan has a theory, he said. Rowan always has a theory. His theory is that the Irwin line is older than it presents, he said. That the warrior clans of the far north were originally something different before they became what the Highland lords recognize as a standard pack structure. That some of the old bloodlines, the ones from before the council's records, before the territorial agreements, carried something the later generations lost. He glanced at her. He believes your scent is the first confirmation he has encountered in 30 years of looking. Annie thought about the bronze brooch at her collar. Her father holding an eastern flank for 9 hours for 400 lives that were not his blood or his obligation. The old letters in a library that a careless man had never opened. The old Lycan words she had read by candlelight in a house where she was labor, not family. What does that mean? She said. Practically. We don't know yet, Caius said. Rowan thinks it will become clearer over time. He is irritatingly comfortable with not knowing things immediately. And you? He considered this with his usual unhurried honesty. I think you are exactly what you are, he said, whatever that turns out to be entirely. And I think I have 2 days of knowing you and the rest of my life to learn the rest. And I find that... He paused, chose the word carefully. Sufficient. She looked at him riding beside her in the cold mountain pass, this man who spoke in sentences that only needed to be true, who had smiled at her completely exactly once, and would probably do so again when the moment earned it. The warmth at the base of her chest, the coal placed gently there at the solstice, was steady, real. The Lycan hold appeared on the afternoon of the third day, emerging from the mountain rock as though it had grown there rather than been built. Dark stone, high walls, windows cut to let in light from every angle, banners of black with the crescent moon and bone crown moving slowly in the cold highland wind. Annie stopped her horse at the ridge and looked at it for a long moment. It was not the life she had planned. She had not, if she was honest, been able to plan a life. She had been surviving at the edge of other people's plans for 23 years, watching from side doors, reading other people's letters, sewing dresses for men who had already decided. This was hers. Inside those walls, a library of 4,000 volumes. A great hall where morning light came through mountain stone and turned everything briefly golden. People she did not know yet and would spend years learning. A man who had walked into a crowded hall and found her by scent and asked her, with 3 quiet words, how she knew, and had listened, fully and completely, to everything she said after. Caius stopped beside her and waited, the way he had learned to wait, giving her the moment without filling it. It's real, she said. It's real, he confirmed. She exhaled, one slow breath of cold mountain air that tasted of pine and stone, and the particular honesty of altitude, and rode forward. The council never formally contested the bond. Aldrich retired from his position the following spring, citing health, and was replaced by a younger lord from the eastern packs who had spent 10 years under Lycan protection and had no appetite for dismantling it. The Highland Pass agreements were renewed and expanded. 12 smaller packs that had been operating without formal protection came under Lycan authority within the first year. Dorian Ashvile married Seraphine Morn. It was, by all accounts, exactly the alliance their families had wanted, and exactly as personally hollow as alliances built entirely on politics tend to be. He was seen twice in the years that followed at Highland assemblies, and on both occasions, he asked after the Lycan hold with the careful indirection of someone asking about something they had decided not to think about too directly. No one carried his questions north. Petra came to visit 6 months after the bonding, as promised. She stayed for 3 weeks. On the second week, she and Roan had a conversation in the library that lasted 4 hours, the subject of which neither of them fully disclosed, and Roan arranged for a permanent position at the hold for a research assistant who was, he explained to Caius with complete neutrality, necessary for a long-term project. Caius looked at Annie. Annie looked at her tea. They did not discuss it further. Stellan remained exactly himself, which was what everyone had expected, and most people had quietly counted on. Edric received, in the autumn following the bonding, a formal letter from the Lycan hold, acknowledging the debt the Lycan house had owed the Irwin line, and settling it with a land grant in the Western Highland. Modest, productive, more than he had any right to expect, and exactly what an old man with no family needed to end his days in something better than indifference. He did not write back. Annie had not expected him to. She had sent the letter anyway. That was the difference between who she had been and who she was. Annie learned the library. Not quickly. 4,000 volumes did not yield themselves to impatience, and she had, for the first time in her life, both the access and the time to go slowly. She worked through the old Lycan texts with the same thoroughness she had given Edric's letters by candlelight, but now in a room with wide mountain windows and a fire that no one asked her to build herself. Roan's theory about the Irwin bloodline became, over the following years, less a theory and more a documented history. Ancient, half-erased, but traceable. A lineage that predated the Highland Council by centuries. Something that the Council's careful record-keeping had buried not out of malice, but out of simple indifference to anything that didn't fit the current hierarchy. Her father had carried it. She carried it. What it meant in full was a question that unfurled slowly, over years, in the way that true things tend to unfurl. Caius learned her in the way he did everything, without hurry, without performance, with the complete and steady attention of someone who had decided that the most important things deserved to be known properly. He learned the way she went quiet when she was working something out, rather than when she was unhappy. He learned that she laughed more than she showed in public, and cried less than people expected, and held grudges not at all, having spent enough of her life in proximity to small cruelties to understand that carrying them cost more than releasing them. He learned the things she had never told anyone, because there had never been anyone to tell. She learned him in return, the early mornings on the walls. The way he spoke in meetings versus the way he spoke when it was the two of them and the fire and no one requiring anything. The dreams that woke him sometimes. Old ones, Lycan old. The kind that came with a bloodline as ancient as his. The fact that he had been lonely in a way that power makes lonelier, not less. Because power surrounds you with people who need things from you, and genuine presence becomes rare and therefore precious. She was genuine presence. He told her so, exactly once, on a winter morning 2 years after the solstice, standing on the eastern wall of the hold where the mountains went on until they disappeared into cloud. He said it simply, without ceremony, the way he said all the things that mattered most. She believed him. Not because she was naive, not because she had forgotten what it had cost her to believe the wrong person once, but because she had spent 2 years learning the difference between a man who speaks with an audience in mind and a man who speaks because the words are simply true. She pressed her shoulder against his in the cold mountain air, and he put his arm around her, and they stood on the wall while the clouds moved over the ranges, and the hold below them went about its mourning. And it was, in every way that counted, enough. It was, in fact, everything.